So look at this. Another black bum turning my street into his living room. Deputy Shane Kowalski said it loud. Not to Calvin, to the air. Like Calvin, Jerome Brooks wasn't worth the breath of direct address. Then he grabbed the cart and flipped it. One motion, no warning. Medications scattered across wet pavement. A framed photograph cracked against the concrete. 6 years of VA appeal documents fanned into a puddle and bled ink. Kowalski watched it all fall. Then he laughed, short, ugly, satisfied. "What's wrong gonna cry over your little treasures? This is why you people can't have nice things." He kicked the broken photograph toward the gutter with the toe of his boot. Nobody's coming to save you. Nobody even sees you. You're invisible, old man. Always have been. Then he crouched, 6 inches from Calvin's face. "You're not human. You're trash that walks, and trash belongs in the street." Calvin didn't flinch, didn't curse. Just looked him dead in the eyes and said quietly, "I know who you are." Kowalski laughed and walked away. He had no idea a zoom lens from across the street had captured every word clean enough for a federal courtroom. Drop your city and local time below. And if you're not subscribed, this is exactly why we're here. Hey there, everyone. There's a porch light still on somewhere down the line and someone behind it with a story to tell. Let's go knock. Calvin Jerome Brooks was born in Garfield, Georgia on a Tuesday morning in March of 1966 in a house on Delmar Street that his grandfather had built with his own hands. The neighborhood was black working class and proud in the way that communities become proud when the rest of the world spends decades trying to convince them they shouldn't be. He grew up knowing 2 things with absolute certainty. First, that his mother, Evelyn Brooks, was the most dignified woman he had ever seen, a woman who cleaned other people's office buildings from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. and still managed to press her church clothes before Sunday service. Second, that the United States Army was his way out and his way up, and his way of proving something that shouldn't have needed proving, that a black boy from Delmar Street could carry this country on his back with the same strength as anyone else. He enlisted at 18. By 22, he had completed engineer training and was designing field fortifications in the Gulf. By 30, he had earned a service record that made senior officers stop and read it twice. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, 22 years total, most of them spent in places where the temperature hit 120 degrees and the ground beneath your boots could kill you if you read it wrong. He came home in 2008 with an honorable discharge, a chest full of commendations, and a rare degenerative nerve condition that the Army doctors had documented, but the VA somehow could not locate in their system. The appeals process began in 2009. It was still pending. In the years between, the medical bills accumulated the way water fills a basement, slowly at first, then all at once. He sold the car in 2015. The house in 2018. By 2022, Calvin Jerome Brooks, decorated combat engineer, 22-year veteran son of Evelyn Brooks of Delmar Street, was living beneath the overpass 3 blocks from the house where he was born. He did not consider this defeat. He considered it a temporary condition that the VA's bureaucratic incompetence had imposed on him, and which he intended to correct through proper legal channels with documentation in the order required. He was methodical about it. Military training had given him the understanding that every problem has a process, and the process must be respected even when the problem makes you want to scream. His shopping cart was organized with the precision of a field kit. Waterproof folder front left. VA appeal documents organized chronologically, each page in a plastic sleeve. Behind it, his DD-214 discharge papers, his commendations, his medical records. Front right, his prescription bottle for nerve pain medication, 72 pills filled 4 days ago, enough for 3 weeks if he was careful. Bottom shelf, 3 cans of food, a change of socks, a small Bible his grandmother had pressed into his hands the morning he shipped out for the first time, telling him to keep it close, because God traveled lighter than luggage but arrived faster than any transport plane. And in the front basket, wrapped in a piece of cloth, a framed photograph of his mother. Evelyn Brooks, 1943 to 2019. Smiling the way she always smiled, like she knew something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet. That was Calvin's world. Small, organized, and his. He had been at the Delmar Street bench since 5:45 that morning, having risen early as he always did, old habits from a life where sleeping past sunrise meant falling behind. His plan for the day was the same as every Tuesday: walk 6 blocks to the public library when it opened at 9, use the computer terminal to check the VA case portal, print any new correspondence, update his appeal log, then back to the bench for the afternoon. Quiet, orderly, patient. He was not by any reasonable definition of the word a problem, but Garfield had been changing. The kind of changing that happens when development money arrives and City Hall starts seeing certain neighborhoods not as communities, but as square footage. Harland and Cross Development Group had purchased 3 parcels within 4 blocks of Delmar Street in the past 18 months. Their plans, gleaming mixed-use towers, rooftop restaurants, a boutique hotel, required a certain aesthetic. And that aesthetic did not include men like Calvin sitting on benches with shopping carts. The sheriff's department had received what insiders later described as informal guidance about the Delmar corridor. Nothing in writing, nothing official, just conversations. Just the kind of understandings that get reached over breakfast meetings when enough money is in the room. Deputy Shane Kowalski had been on this beat for 3 years. He was 34, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from spending a career in uniform without ever being seriously questioned. He had rousted Calvin before twice in the past month alone. Told him to move along. Calvin had moved temporarily, because he understood the value of picking the right moment for the right fight. But he had always come back to Delmar Street. It was his street. It had been his street before Kowalski was born. Across Delmar, in the window of a small cafe called Rosie's, a young woman named Nora Okafor sat with a cappuccino she hadn't touched and a camera she hadn't put down. 29 years old staff photojournalist at the Garfield Courier, 3 months into an investigation about neighborhood displacement that her editor, Pete Callahan, had greenlit with one condition: bring me something undeniable. She had been watching the bench since Kowalski's cruiser pulled to the curb. She watched him step out. She watched him approach. She raised the camera, adjusted the zoom, and pressed record. She had no idea she was about to capture the most important 32 seconds of her career. Kowalski didn't rush. That was the thing Nora noticed first. Through her viewfinder, he took his time. He walked from the cruiser to the bench with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this before and expected no consequences. Calvin saw him coming. He kept his hands visible on his knees, another habit from years of knowing that a black man's hands in the wrong moment could be misread as a weapon. He looked up when Kowalski was 10 feet away. His expression was neutral, watchful. "Up," Kowalski said. Just that. One word like Calvin was a dog he'd grown tired of. "Good morning, Deputy." Calvin's voice was calm. "I'm sitting on a public bench on a public sidewalk. I'm not blocking foot traffic. I'm not disturbing anyone." Kowalski stopped in front of him, looked him up and down with the slow, deliberate contempt of someone who has decided the outcome of this interaction before it began. "I said up. That means you stand, you collect your garbage, and you move down the block. We clear." "We're not clear," Calvin said, still measured. "Because I know my rights, Deputy. A public bench is public property. I have legal standing to, you have legal standing. Kowalski repeated it back slowly, like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. He shook his head. Listen to you. 20 years of sleeping under bridges and you've got legal standing. Calvin said nothing. He had learned in the army, in VA waiting rooms, in every encounter with men like this, that silence was sometimes the sharpest response available. Kowalski's eyes moved to the cart. He studied it the way a man studies something he's already decided to destroy. That thing is a hazard, he said. It's a shopping cart with my belongings in it. It is not in the pedestrian path. It is directly beside the bench. I said it's a hazard. Kowalski stepped to the cart, put both hands on the handle. So I'm removing the hazard. Calvin stood. Not aggressively, he rose slowly, carefully, the way a man rises when he wants to make clear he is not a threat, but also will not be invisible. Sir, his voice was firm now. Those are my legal documents and my medical supplies. My prescription medication is in that cart. I am asking you respectfully not to touch it. Kowalski looked at Calvin's hand on the cart, then looked at Calvin's face. Something shifted behind his eyes, not doubt, but decision. He pulled. The cart went over hard. The sound it made, metal on concrete, the clatter of a life hitting the ground, cut through the morning air like a gunshot. The prescription bottle hit the pavement and skittered into a puddle. 72 pills, 4 days old, 3 weeks of pain management filling with water. The waterproof folder burst open on impact, and 6 years of VA appeal documents. Every form, every letter, every carefully preserved piece of evidence of a debt this country owed. One of its soldiers fanned out across the wet sidewalk and began absorbing the morning's rain. The Bible landed spine up. Pages splayed open like broken wings, and the photograph, Evelyn Brooks, 1943 to 2019, smiling like she knew something, hit the concrete corner first and cracked. A fault line ran straight across her face. Calvin stood very still. His chest rose and fell. His hands hanging at his sides were absolutely steady. Later, Nora would say, that was the thing that undid her, watching a man, with everything on the ground, keep his hands that still. Kowalski stepped over the scattered papers. Got close. 6 inches. See, what's wrong, gonna cry over your little treasures? This is why you people can't have nice things. Across the street, 2 white joggers in matching gear appeared at the corner. They slowed. Took in the scene, the deputy, the overturned cart, the black man standing in the wreckage of his belongings. One of them murmured something to the other. They crossed to the opposite sidewalk and kept running. A delivery driver in a brown truck rolled to a stop at the light. Watched through the windshield. The light turned green. He drove. Kowalski kicked the cracked photograph toward the gutter with the toe of his boot. Casual. Like he was moving a piece of litter. Nobody's coming to save you. Nobody even sees you. You're invisible, old man. Always have been. He crouched down to Calvin's eye level. His voice dropped to something almost conversational. Pa, you're not human. You're trash that walks. And trash belongs in the street. Calvin looked at him. The look was not angry, or rather it was not only angry. It was the look of a man cataloging something, filing it away, remembering. I know who you are, deputy. Kowalski held the look for 3 seconds. Then he laughed one short, dismissive sound and straightened up. Adjusted his belt. Walked back to his cruiser without looking back, without hurrying, without a single sign that he believed anything about this moment would follow him. 32 seconds. That was all it had taken. In the cafe window, Nora Okafor lowered her camera. Her coffee had gone completely cold. Her hands, steady all the way through, professional all the way through, were shaking now. She looked at the screen. The footage was clean. Audio was clean. Every word, every kick, every second of it clean. She looked back across the street at Calvin, who was on his knees gathering his mother's photograph from the gutter, holding the cracked frame together with both hands. She already knew this footage could change things. She also knew this town well enough to know that things that could change everything sometimes got buried before morning. Nora drove straight to the courier office and walked into Pete Callahan's office without knocking. Pete was 58, had run the Garfield Courier for 19 years, and had the particular tired look of a man who had spent 2 decades telling uncomfortable truths to a town that preferred comfortable silence. He had a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Editor" that his daughter had given him, and a credenza stacked with files that he claimed to have a system for and didn't. He looked up when Nora came in, saw her face, put down his coffee. "Play it," he said. She played it. He watched it twice without speaking, without moving. When it ended the second time, he set his glasses on the desk and rubbed his eyes with both hands. "How's the audio?" "Perfect. Every word." "How stable is the image?" "I was on a zoom lens from across the street. Completely steady." Pete nodded slowly. The nod of a man calculating risk, the way engineers calculate load-bearing weight carefully, because getting it wrong has permanent consequences. "Nora," he said, "if we run this, you need to understand what this county will do to us." "I know." Macklin has been sheriff for 16 years. Kowalski is his deputy. The people who advertise in this paper are the same people who play golf with the mayor. "I know Pete." He looked at her for a long moment, then picked up his glasses and put them back on. "When can you have the story written?" She had it filed by 3 in the afternoon. They published at 6 p.m. online first, because print wouldn't hit doorsteps until morning, and in 2024, waiting until morning meant losing the story entirely. By 8 p.m., the footage had been viewed 40,000 times. By 10 p.m., 112,000. By the time Pete arrived at the office the next morning, the number was past 200,000, and 3 national outlets had reached out requesting permission to republish. A morning news producer in Atlanta had already cut a clip for broadcast. 2 journalists from Chicago were asking for Nora's contact information. Garfield, Georgia population 80,000, known primarily for its Peach Festival, and a minor league baseball team that finished last in its division every year, was suddenly everywhere. The Garfield County Sheriff's Department responded at noon. The statement was 4 paragraphs long. It used the phrase, "the individual," 11 times. It did not use Calvin's name once. It did not use the word "veteran" once. It described the incident as a lawful public order enforcement action conducted in accordance with department protocols for maintaining pedestrian safety and public access. It said there was no evidence of misconduct. Sheriff Roy Macklin held a press conference at 2 in the afternoon in front of the department building, a squat brick structure on Marion Avenue with an American flag that hung slightly crooked in the wind. He was 61, silver-haired, with the weathered look of a man who had spent decades turning problems into non-events. He spoke with the measured confidence of someone who had done this before and expected it to work again. "My deputies are not on trial for doing their jobs," he said. "This department serves all residents of Garfield County with professionalism and dedication. What you see in a 30-second video clip does not represent the full context of a law enforcement interaction." Beside him stood Kowalski's union representative, a compact man named Gary Tressel, who had the permanent expression of someone preparing to be disappointed by human beings. He leaned into the microphone. Deputy Kowalski acted within established protocol. The footage being circulated online has been selectively framed and lacks critical context. We have full confidence in the deputy's conduct and in this department's review process. The phrase lacks critical context spread through conservative local media like weather. By evening, 3 social media accounts, none of them traceable to real people, were posting an old clip from 2021 Calvin raising his voice at a gas station clerk during what had actually been a billing dispute over a charge he hadn't made. The clip had no context. The caption read, "Here's the innocent veteran the media wants you to cry about." The reframing had begun. Internal Affairs opened a review that same afternoon. The lead investigator assigned was a man named Sergeant Dale Pruitt, who had served alongside Kowalski for 4 years before his promotion to IA and still met him for lunch on the second Friday of every month. None of this was disclosed in the department's press materials. That evening, Calvin was sitting on the steps of Greater Calvary Baptist Church on Emmett Street, where Reverend Marcus Dwight had offered him temporary shelter after hearing about the incident from a congregant. Reverend Dwight had driven to Delmar Street himself that morning, helped Calvin gather what remained of his belongings, and said simply, "You're coming with me until this settles." Calvin had accepted. Not gratefully, gratitude felt too small for what Reverend Dwight was doing, but honestly. He sat on the church steps as the evening came in, and 2 county deputies appeared on the sidewalk across the street. Not Kowalski, younger men. They approached slowly, hands visible, voices friendly. "Mr. Brooks." The taller one offered a careful smile. "We just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing okay after this morning." Calvin watched them. "Sukikorina, we've actually been looking into some options for you. There are some good services available in Atlanta, transitional housing, veteran-specific programs. We could even arrange transportation if you're interested in a fresh start." Calvin let the silence sit for a moment. "I was born in this town," he said finally. "I'll leave when I'm ready." The deputies exchanged a glance, nodded politely, walked back to their cruiser. Calvin watched the car until it turned the corner. Then he reached into his coat pocket and held the cracked photograph frame in his hands, running his thumb slowly along the fault line across his mother's face. Somewhere across town in the Courier parking lot, Nora walked out to her car after a 12-hour day and stopped. Both front tires were flat. Clean cuts, not road damage. A folded note was tucked under the windshield wiper. She opened it. 2 words printed in block letters. "Let it go." She stood in the parking lot for a long moment. Then she took out her phone and photographed the tires, the note, and the date on her watch. Filed it away. Evidence was evidence. She called Pete Callahan. He answered on the second ring. "They slashed my tires," she said. A long pause. Then, "Are you safe?" "Yes." Another pause. "Then we're not letting it go." The tire slashing was reported to the Garfield Police Department at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The officer who took the report was courteous, professional, and thorough. He assigned a case number, photographed the tires, bagged the note as potential evidence, and told Nora they would follow up within 72 hours. Nobody followed up. Pete Callahan arrived at the office the next morning to find a voicemail from Bradley Hurst, owner of Hurst Chevrolet, the Courier's largest advertiser, a man whose full-page color spreads ran every Sunday without fail, whose spending accounted for roughly 14% of the paper's annual advertising revenue. The message was brief. Bradley's voice was not angry. It was something more unsettling than angry. It was calm. "Pete, I think you know why I'm calling. Give me a ring when you get a chance." Pete called him back before his coffee finished brewing. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Bradley didn't threaten. He didn't use any word that could be cited later as intimidation. He simply explained that he'd been giving the matter some thought and given the current climate and given the sensitivity of the situation, he felt it was best to pause his advertising relationship with the Courier while things settled down. Just temporarily, just until the dust cleared. He wished Pete well. He hoped the paper understood. 3 more advertisers followed by Thursday. A furniture store, a regional insurance agency, a restaurant supply company whose owner Pete had known for 20 years, who couldn't meet his eyes when they spoke on the phone, and said quietly that he was sorry that he didn't have a choice, that he hoped Pete understood. Pete understood perfectly. He just didn't stop. Meanwhile, the coordinated reframing of Calvin Brooks was accelerating online. The 2021 gas station clip had been viewed 600,000 times across platforms. A conservative radio host in Augusta spent 40 minutes on his morning show describing Calvin as a career agitator with a documented history of confrontational behavior. He cited no sources because there were no sources. He didn't need them. By the time a correction could be issued, the characterization had already become somebody's truth. Anonymous accounts posted satellite images of the Delmar Street area with captions about public safety concerns and neighborhood quality of life. Others dug through Calvin's service records, which were publicly accessible through a records request that someone had clearly filed specifically for this purpose, and highlighted a single disciplinary note from 1994, a minor insubordination citation that had been resolved and expunged within the same year. It was presented without context as evidence of a troubled military career. Calvin read none of this. He didn't have consistent internet access. What he knew was what Reverend Dwight told him carefully and gently over coffee in the church kitchen each morning. He listened, nodded, said very little. On Wednesday, his camp beneath the Delmar Street overpass was cleared by the city. He wasn't there when it happened. He was at the library at the computer terminal, checking the VA case portal as he did every Tuesday and Wednesday. He returned to find the space empty. The tarp, the sleeping bag, the small folding chair he'd carried for 8 months, the spare change of clothes, the backup folder of documents he'd kept separate from the cart as a precaution, gone, tagged and removed as abandoned property under a city ordinance that allowed immediate clearance of unattended encampments. His medications from the overturned cart had already been destroyed, soaked through, and rendered unusable within minutes of hitting the puddle. His refill wasn't due for another 17 days. Without insurance, the out-of-pocket cost was $212. He had $23. He came back to the church and sat in the small common room for 3 hours without speaking. Reverend Dwight sat across from him, reading Not Pushing. 2 congregation members came and went, quietly leaving a plate of food that Calvin eventually ate slowly and without tasting. Finally, he looked up. "They took her picture," he said. Reverend Dwight set down his book. "The photograph, it was in the camp. I had the cracked one from the cart. But the backup, the good one, the one I kept wrapped in the shirt that was in the camp." The Reverend was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand on Calvin's forearm. "Then we make sure the world knows what they took." On Saturday morning, a silver sedan pulled into the church parking lot, and a man in a charcoal blazer stepped out carrying a leather briefcase and the look of someone who had been driving since before sunrise because he had made a decision and didn't see any reason to delay it. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the deliberate movement of a man who chose every step carefully. James Elwood had built his civil rights practice in Atlanta over 23 years. He had taken 41 cases to federal court. He had won 37 of them. He had driven to Garfield, Georgia on a Saturday because he watched Nora's footage on Wednesday night and couldn't sleep afterward. He sat across from Calvin in the church's small conference room and listened for 2 hours. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes at first, just listened with the complete attention of someone who understood that the story mattered as much as the facts, because juries were human beings before they were jurors. When Calvin finished, Elwood opened his briefcase and removed a single manila folder. He placed it on the table and slid it across without comment. Calvin opened it. Inside was a federal database printout, a case history. A name he recognized from the search results, Deputy Shane Kowalski. The record went back 7 years. Elwood tapped the folder once with one finger. "This isn't the first time his name appeared in a federal database," he said. "It won't be the last." Calvin looked up from the folder. For the first time since Tuesday morning, something shifted in his eyes. Not relief, not yet, but the specific alertness of a man who has just realized the fight has terrain he didn't know existed. The folder contained 3 cases, not rumors, not allegations that had dissolved under pressure. 3 formally filed civil rights complaints. 3 separate black residents of Garfield County. 3 separate incidents spanning 7 years, all involving Deputy Shane Kowalski, all closed at the county level within 60 days of filing, all bearing the identical concluding language. Insufficient evidence of misconduct to warrant further action. James Elwood walked Calvin through each one slowly, the way a doctor delivers difficult news, clearly, completely, without softening the parts that needed to be heard in full. The first was from 2017. A man named Theodore Gaines, 63. A retired postal worker had filed a complaint alleging that Kowalski had entered his property without a warrant during a neighbor dispute call, destroyed a small garden shed, while conducting a search, and used racially derogatory language throughout the encounter. The complaint was investigated by the department's Internal Affairs Unit. Closed in 48 days. Insufficient evidence. The second was from 2019. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, 47, a licensed practical nurse, had reported that Kowalski stopped her vehicle 3 times in 6 weeks on the same stretch of Emmett Street, each time without issuing a citation, each time asking questions that had nothing to do with traffic law. Her formal complaint cited racial profiling. Closed in 31 days. Insufficient evidence. The third stopped Calvin's breath. Robert Delaney. 67 years old, retired schoolteacher, 31 years in the Garfield public school system, the last 14 of them teaching 8th grade history at the same school Calvin had attended as a boy. In 2019, Kowalski had conducted what the department called a welfare check at Delaney's home following a noise complaint from a neighbor. During the interaction, Delaney's medication insulin, stored in a small cooler by the front door, was confiscated as unidentified substances pending verification and never returned. Delaney filed a complaint. It was closed in 55 days. 8 months later, Robert Delaney died of a diabetic episode in his own home. Calvin set the folder down. His hands were still. His jaw was tight. "I knew him," Calvin said quietly. "Mr. Delaney. He taught me history. He's the one who told me the Army would take me seriously if I took myself seriously first." Elwood said nothing. He gave the silence the space it deserved. After a long moment, Calvin looked up. "The insulin was never given back. Never. The department has no record of its confiscation." Calvin nodded slowly, the nod of a man adding something to an internal ledger that had been running for a very long time. Nora Okafor, meanwhile, had been pulling threads of her own. 3 weeks into a public records request that the county had been slow-walking since the story broke, she had received a partial release of emails between the Sheriff's Department Administrative Office and outside parties. Most were redacted. But one had slipped through the redaction process with its subject line and timestamp intact, sent at 6:47 a.m. on the morning of Calvin's incident. from a Harland and Cross corporate email address to the Sheriff's Department administrative inbox. Subject line Delmar Street, time sensitive. The body of the email was redacted, but the timestamp told its own story. Kowalski had arrived at Delmar Street at 7:14 a.m., 27 minutes after that email was sent. Nora brought her findings to Elwood's temporary office, a borrowed conference room at a law firm on Jefferson Street, whose senior partner was a former Elwood client. She spread her documents across the table and walked him through the timeline. Elwood listened with his glasses off, which Nora had already learned meant he was thinking hardest. "Harland and Cross," he said. "They're $180,000 across Macklin's last 2 election campaigns," Nora said. "I pulled the campaign finance filings. It's all public record. 3 clearance operations near their development sites in the past 18 months, all documented in city enforcement logs, all targeting the same demographic, all happening within weeks of Harland and Cross submitting site development applications." She placed the development application dates beside the enforcement operation dates. The correlation was not subtle. "Calvin wasn't random," Elwood said. "He was on a sidewalk that a developer needed empty by 8 a.m. Elwood put his glasses back on. He picked up his pen. He began writing and didn't stop for several minutes. That evening, Elwood sat across from Calvin again in the church conference room and spread everything out: the 3 prior cases, the Harland and Cross email, the campaign finance records, the clearance operation timeline. Calvin read it all carefully, the way he read everything methodically, completely, without skipping ahead to the conclusion, before he'd processed the evidence. When he finished, he sat back. "I spent 22 years fighting for this country," he said. His voice was level, completely controlled. The control cost him something. Elwood could see it in the line of his jaw, in the careful way he was breathing. "I fought in places where the ground could kill you. I came home and the VA spent 6 years losing my paperwork. I lost my house. I lost everything except what fit in a cart." He paused. "And this country sent a man to kick over my mother's photograph so a real estate developer could have a clean sidewalk for his 8 o'clock meeting." Nobody in the room said anything. Then Calvin straightened, squared his shoulders the way a soldier squares his shoulders, not for comfort, but for clarity. "What do we do next?" Elwood had already drafted the federal civil rights complaint. He had filed it with the FBI's Civil Rights Division field office in Atlanta at 4:30 that afternoon. He slid a copy across the table. "We wait," Elwood said, "but not for long." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, read the message once, then looked up at Calvin with an expression that was careful and precise and almost but not quite a smile. "Special Agent Dana Whitfield has been assigned to the case," he said. "She's already read the file. She wants to come to Garfield, in person, this week." Special Agent Dana Whitfield drove to Garfield on a Thursday, in an unmarked gray sedan without calling ahead. That was intentional. In her 20 years with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, she had learned that advance notice of federal interest in a local department produced 2 things with remarkable consistency: suddenly cooperative administrators and mysteriously incomplete records. She preferred to arrive before either of those conditions had time to develop. She was 44, lean with silver threading through dark hair she kept pulled back in a way that suggested practicality rather than style. She had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 2 decades in rooms where the wrong movement at the wrong moment cost people everything. She did not waste gestures. She did not waste words. Her partner, Agent Ray Coburn, drove. She read the file for the 3rd time on the way up from Atlanta, not because she'd missed anything, but because the 3rd reading was always where she found what mattered most. the thing beneath the thing, the detail that looked like background until you understood the pattern. They met Calvin first. 4 hours in the borrowed conference room on Jefferson Street with Elwood present and a recorder running that Calvin had consented to in writing before they began. Whitfield asked her questions in the same order she always did, chronological, specific, without interpretation. She let him tell it in his own language at his own pace. She interrupted only to clarify a detail, never to redirect. When he described the moment the cart went over, the sound of it, the prescription bottle hitting the puddle, the photograph cracking, she wrote something down and underlined it twice. He didn't see what it was. After Calvin, they interviewed Nora. 90 minutes. Whitfield watched the full uncut footage twice on Nora's laptop. Not the version that had circulated online, but the original file uncompressed with intact metadata that confirmed the recording had not been edited in any way. She watched the 90 seconds before the cart went over. Calvin sitting still, hands visible, not blocking anything, not speaking to anyone. Then she watched the 32 seconds 3 times in succession. After Nora, Reverend Dwight. 40 minutes. He described the men who had come to offer Calvin a bus ticket to Atlanta, the manner in which Calvin's encampment had been cleared while he was at the library, the systematic removal of every material anchor Calvin had to remaining in Garfield. On the drive to the sheriff's department the next morning, Coburn asked her what she was thinking. "So I'm thinking this is the cleanest footage I've had in 6 years, she said. "And I'm thinking clean footage is only half the case." She served the subpoenas, personally carrying them through the front door of the sheriff's department at 8:15 a.m. on a Friday. The desk sergeant who received them looked at the federal seal, looked at Whitfield's badge, and reached for the phone before she had cleared the lobby. Macklin's attorney called him before Whitfield's sedan had left the parking lot. Macklin received the news in his office behind his desk, a coffee cup in his hand, that he set down very carefully because his hand was not entirely steady. "On what grounds?" he said. "Civil rights pattern and practice," his attorney said, "and potentially conspiracy." Macklin was quiet for a long moment. "The IA review is suspended. The FBI has jurisdiction now." The Internal Affairs review, already compromised by Pruitt's relationship with Kowalski, was shut down within the hour. The department's legal counsel issued a memo to all personnel: no communications about the Kowalski matter. No interviews without counsel, present, all records access frozen pending federal review. The subpoenas covered everything. All department communications in the 72 hours surrounding the incident. Kowalski's full personnel file, including disciplinary history. All body camera records with metadata. Financial records related to any communication with Harland and Cross Development Group. The files from the 3 prior closed complaints. It was while processing the body camera records request that something unexpected surfaced. A deputy named Linda Chen had been on patrol 3 blocks from Delmar Street on the morning of the incident. Standard protocol required body cameras to activate automatically when a deputy exited a vehicle. Kowalski's department-issued camera had, according to the equipment log, malfunctioned that morning and failed to record. This malfunction had been noted in the equipment report filed the same afternoon. Linda Chen's camera had not malfunctioned. She had driven past Delmar Street at 7:08 a.m., 6 minutes before Kowalski arrived. Her footage showed the empty bench, the cart, Calvin arriving with coffee from a nearby convenience store, sitting down organizing his papers. Nothing blocking the sidewalk. Nobody causing any disturbance. She had also recorded from a distance approximately 20 seconds of the incident itself before her patrol route took her around the corner, enough to confirm the cart going over, confirm Kowalski's posture, confirm Calvin's stillness. She had kept this footage. Not submitted it, not deleted it, kept it on a personal backup drive. Because Linda Chen had been a deputy for 9 years and had a careful, methodical nature that Whitfield recognized when she sat across from her in a federal interview room on Saturday afternoon. "Why didn't you submit it through the department?" Whitfield asked. Linda Chen looked at her hands for a moment. "Because I knew what would happen to it." She handed over the drive without being asked. That same afternoon, Elwood received an anonymous call from a number that traced to a burner phone. The voice was male, brief, and nervous. "There are 2 more recordings. The Delaney welfare check in 2019. Another stop from 2020 nobody filed a complaint about. I know where they are. I'm not ready to give my name yet." Elwood wrote down everything and called Whitfield immediately. She listened to the summary without interruption. When he finished, she said 4 words. "Tell him we're ready." Outside the federal building that evening in the parking lot, Nora published her second piece in the Courier, a full reconstruction of the Harland and Cross connection, the campaign donations, the morning email, the development timeline. Within 3 hours, it had been picked up by the Associated Press, and in a church on Emmett Street, Calvin Jerome Brooks sat by a window and watched the city go dark, holding a cracked photograph frame in his hands, running his thumb along the fault line across his mother's face. He didn't know yet what was coming, but he had spent 22 years learning to read terrain. And for the first time in 14 months, the terrain felt like it was shifting. The 2 black FBI SUVs arrived at the Garfield County Sheriff's Department at 8:03 a.m. on a Monday morning. They parked in the visitor spaces out front, not the law enforcement spaces along the side, not the unmarked spots behind the building. The visitor spaces where everyone walking in and out of the building could see them. Whitfield had chosen that deliberately. Visibility was its own kind of message. She walked through the front door, carrying a federal warrant and a manila folder, and the expression of someone who had done this enough times to know that the first 30 seconds set the temperature for everything that followed. She kept her pace even. Her voice when she addressed the desk sergeant was professionally courteous and entirely immovable. "Special Agent Dana Whitfield, FBI Civil Rights Division. I have a federal warrant for records, and I'll need a room for witness interviews. Please notify Sheriff Macklin that we're here." The sergeant reached for the phone. His hand was not steady. Macklin appeared from the back corridor 4 minutes later, his attorney 1 step behind him. He had the look of a man who had spent the weekend preparing for this moment and still wasn't ready for it. He extended his hand to Whitfield with the reflexive courtesy of a politician who had shaken hands through every difficulty of a 16-year career. Whitfield shook it. Then she handed him the warrant. "Sheriff, the warrant covers all departmental communications, personnel files, equipment logs, and financial records related to the matters outlined in the attached exhibit. Your IT director will need to be available within the hour for records preservation protocols. Any attempt to access, modify, or delete covered records from this point forward constitutes obstruction of a federal investigation." Macklin's attorney read the warrant quickly. His expression did not change, but he put his hand briefly on Macklin's arm, the subtle, firm pressure of a man communicating, "Do not speak through contact." Macklin did not speak. Kowalski was pulled from his patrol shift at 9:15. He arrived at the interview room in his uniform, which Whitfield noted he hadn't been given time to change, hadn't been given time to prepare a presentation of himself. He sat across from her with his union representative beside him, arms crossed, jaw set with the specific confidence of a man who believed the system would protect him because it always had. "Talk to Deputy Kowalski." Whitfield began, her voice even and unhurried. "I'd like to walk through the events of Tuesday morning on Delmar Street. I'm going to show you some footage, and I'd like you to describe what you see." She placed a laptop on the table and played Nora's footage. The full 90 seconds before the incident, than the 32 seconds. Audio clean, image stable, every word, every motion, every kicked photograph rendered in complete clarity. Kowalski watched it with the careful neutrality of someone controlling their face. When it ended, he said, "The footage doesn't show the full context of the interaction." Whitfield nodded, made a note, then placed a second laptop on the table. "This is Deputy Linda Chen's body camera footage from 7:08 a.m. that morning, 6 minutes before your arrival. I'd like you to watch it and tell me if it provides any additional context." She played it. The empty bench, Calvin arriving, sitting down, organizing his papers. The sidewalk completely clear. The union representative shifted in his chair. "And this," Whitfield said, placing a tablet on the table beside the two laptops, "is footage recovered from a department backup drive covering a 2019 welfare check conducted at the residence of Robert Delaney on Calhoun Street. This footage was reported as non-existent in the department's equipment log." She pressed play. The room changed. Not dramatically, no one collapsed. No one shouted. The change was quieter and more devastating than that. It was the change that happens when people in a room realize simultaneously that the version of events they've been defending no longer exists. On the tablet screen, Kowalski's voice from 6 years ago said things that could not be explained, by protocol could not be reframed, as procedure could not survive a federal courtroom. The union representative leaned toward Kowalski and said very quietly 3 words. "Don't say anything." Kowalski went pale. The confidence didn't leave his face all at once. It left the way water drains from a bathtub gradually and then completely. His jaw remained set, but it was the jaw of a man holding himself together rather than the jaw of a man who believed he was in control. Whitfield closed both laptops and the tablet, capped her pen, stood. "We'll continue this formally with your legal counsel present. Thank you for your time, Deputy." Outside, 2 senior deputies who had been waiting in the corridor asked to speak with federal investigators independently. They were escorted to separate rooms. Both had information about the coordination between the sheriff's office and Harland and Cross. Both had kept notes. One had printed emails he wasn't supposed to have access to and kept them in an envelope in his car for 2 years, waiting for a moment when federal jurisdiction made it safe to produce them. That moment had arrived. Nora was on the sidewalk outside the building with her camera when Kowalski was escorted to a federal vehicle for further questioning. He wasn't in handcuffs, not yet. But everyone watching understood the geometry of what they were seeing. A man who had walked through this town for 7 years, as though consequence was something that happened to other people, was now being walked somewhere by people who did not work for his sheriff. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Garfield residents, mostly black, some elderly, some who had grown up on these streets and would die on them. They watched in silence that was not passive. It was the silence of people who had been waiting a long time to see something they had been told would never happen. One woman in the crowd held a photograph of Robert Delaney. She didn't say anything. She just held it up. Kowalski did not look at it, but everyone else did. Agent Whitfield stepped to the microphones outside the Garfield Federal Building at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. She had written nothing down. She didn't need to. She had been building toward this statement for 11 days with the same methodical precision she brought to every case gathering, verifying, ensuring that every word she spoke in front of those cameras was supported by evidence that would survive every challenge any defense attorney could construct. She spoke for 6 minutes. Federal civil rights charges had been filed against Deputy Shane Kowalski under Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. The charges included willful destruction of medical property belonging to a disabled veteran, use of racially derogatory language in the conduct of official duties, and a pattern and practice of civil rights violations spanning a minimum of 7 years across, At least 3 documented incidents, with additional incidents under review. Sheriff Roy Macklin had been named in a related federal investigation for failure to supervise systematic suppression of valid civil rights complaints and potential conspiracy with private commercial interests. Specifically, Harland and Cross Development Group to conduct unconstitutional enforcement operations targeting unhoused Black residents in designated development corridors. The 3 previously closed internal affairs cases were being reopened at the federal level. Any individuals who had filed complaints through the county system and received no meaningful response would be contacted by the Civil Rights Division directly. Whitfield did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize. She read the facts with the steady authority of someone who understood that the facts, stated plainly and completely, were more devastating than any rhetoric she could add to them. When she finished, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution raised her hand. "Agent Whitfield, can you speak to what this case represents beyond the individual charges?" Whitfield looked at the reporter for a moment. "This case represents what happens when a system designed to protect people is weaponized against the people it was built to serve. And it represents what happens when that weaponization is documented, preserved, and brought to a jurisdiction that isn't afraid to act on it." She stepped back from the microphones. The reaction was immediate and national. 3 cable news networks ran the statement live. By evening, the story had broken through the noise of a news cycle that consumed everything and retained almost nothing. It had stuck the way certain stories stick when they contain something human beings recognize as true in a way that bypasses argument and lands directly in the chest. Harland and Cross issued a statement at 4:30 p.m. distancing the company from any coordination with law enforcement. The statement was careful and corporate and fooled no one. Their stock price dropped 4% before the market closed. 2 board members submitted resignations by Friday. Their lead attorney contacted the FBI's field office voluntarily on Thursday morning, a movement that legal analysts described publicly as a company trying to get ahead of something it could no longer outrun. Kowalski was suspended without pay, effective immediately. His union, after reviewing the recovered footage from 2019, announced it would not fund his legal defense. The statement they released used the phrase, "conduct inconsistent with the values this organization represents," language that told everyone who read it that the union had watched the Delaney footage and made a calculation about which side of this they could afford to be on. Macklin announced he would not seek re-election. He stood before a single television camera in his office and read 4 sentences from a prepared statement and did not take questions. He did not admit wrongdoing. He used the word transition 3 times. Nobody in Garfield believed a word of it, and he knew they didn't, and he read his 4 sentences anyway, and then the camera turned off. Officer Linda Chen was placed under full federal whistleblower protection. Her signed statement ran to 31 pages. She described 9 years of watching complaints disappear, watching Kowalski's record stay clean through mechanisms she now understood had been deliberate rather than administrative, watching colleagues look away from things they couldn't afford to acknowledge. She described the morning she drove past Delmar Street and saw the cart go over and kept driving because stopping would have cost her everything. "I didn't stop," she told Whitfield during her final formal interview. "I've thought about that every day since. I didn't stop." "You stopped eventually," Whitfield said. Linda Chen nodded. But she didn't look comforted by it. James Elwood stood outside Greater Calvary Baptist Church at 3:07 p.m., watching the press conference on his phone with Calvin beside him. The late afternoon light came through the oak trees that lined Emmett Street and fell across the sidewalk in patterns that shifted when the wind moved the branches. Calvin watched the phone screen through the whole statement. He watched Whitfield say the words, "deprivation of rights, racial civil rights violations, pattern and practice. He watched a federal agent stand in front of cameras in his hometown and say out loud and on record that what had been done to him was wrong, that it had a name, that it was against the law, that it would have consequences. He didn't cheer, didn't raise his fist, didn't say anything at all. He breathed out, slowly, completely, like a man releasing something he had been holding in his chest for a very long time, longer maybe than 14 months, maybe longer than that. Reverend Dwight came out of the church and stood beside him. Neither man spoke. The oak trees moved. The light shifted. Then Elwood's phone rang. A city number, the municipal storage facility on Route 9, where Calvin's belongings had been taken when his encampment was cleared. A worker named Gerald, soft-voiced and careful, explained that he had gone through the items tagged from the Delmar Street clearance and found a framed photograph wrapped in a flannel shirt. He hadn't been able to throw it away. He'd been keeping it on his desk. He asked if someone wanted to come pick it up. Calvin closed his eyes for 3 seconds. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. The photograph was exactly as he'd left it. Evelyn Brooks uncracked in this version. Unscattered, smiling the way she always smiled, like she was holding a secret about how things turned out that she was too gracious to announce. Gerald from the municipal storage facility had wrapped it back in the flannel shirt and set it in a paper bag with the handles folded over, and he handed it to Calvin at the front desk without making a speech about it, which Calvin appreciated more than any speech could have expressed. Calvin drove back to the church with Reverend Dwight and set the photograph on the table in the conference room where he and Elwood had first spread out the case files. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it carefully on the shelf above his bunk beside the cracked frame he had been keeping since Tuesday morning. 2 photographs now, one cracked, one whole. He kept both. 6 weeks after Agent Whitfield's press conference, the federal civil lawsuit reached a settlement. Garfield County agreed to pay $1.4 million. Calvin received $340,000 in personal damages, the largest individual settlement in the county's history, against its own law enforcement. The remaining funds were divided between a new legal aid program for unhoused veterans operating out of 3 county offices, a mandatory civil rights training program for all county law enforcement personnel, and a victims outreach fund for the families of Robert Delaney and the 2 other individuals whose complaints had been suppressed. Robert Delaney's daughter, a woman named Patricia, who taught 4th grade in Macon and had driven to Garfield twice during the investigation to give statements, received a call from Elwood personally. He read her the settlement terms. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I just want people to know he was a good man who deserved better than what they gave him." Elwood told her that was going into the public record. She thanked him. She didn't cry until after she hung up. Then she cried for a long time. Kowalski pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges in a courthouse in Atlanta on a Tuesday morning in November. 27 months federal prison. Permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification in the state of Georgia. He would never carry a badge again. His attorney read a statement on his behalf expressing remorse. The statement used the word regret 4 times and never once said the word wrong. The judge noted that for the record. Then she sentenced him anyway. Sheriff Roy Macklin resigned formally in October before the grand jury proceedings reached their conclusion. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors. In exchange for his testimony about the Harland and Cross coordination, the breakfast meetings, the phone calls, the informal guidance that had sent Kowalski to Delmar Street on a Tuesday morning, he avoided criminal charges. He was required to make a formal public statement acknowledging that the department under his leadership had systematically failed Black residents of Garfield County. He read the statement in a room with no cameras before a small group of community representatives that Elwood had assembled. He read it in the same flat, practiced voice he had used for 16 years of press conferences. When he finished, nobody in the room applauded. Nobody said anything. The silence was its own verdict. Calvin's VA case was approved in December. Retroactive to 2018. The backlog that had stalled his appeal for 6 years was resolved in 11 days after a senator's office contacted the VA following a constituent inquiry generated by the national coverage. 6 years of retroactive benefits arrived as a lump sum that Calvin sat with for 2 days before he knew what to do with it. He rented a room in a boarding house on Hatcher Street, 4 blocks from the bench on Delmar. Small room, clean window radiator that worked most of the time. His own door with his own key. He set his mother's photograph, both of them cracked and whole, on the windowsill where the morning light found them first. Nora Okafor won the Georgia Press Association's Investigative Reporting Award in the spring. She gave a short acceptance speech in which she said the award belonged to the people who told the truth when it cost them something, and that her job was only to make sure the truth had somewhere to go. Pete Callahan sat in the front row and cried, which he denied afterward to everyone who asked. 4 additional Garfield residents came forward following the settlement. 4 more people who had experienced Kowalski's pattern of conduct and stayed silent because silence had seemed like the only survivable option. Their cases were reviewed by the Civil Rights Division. 3 resulted in supplemental federal actions. On a Thursday morning in February, Calvin walked back to Delmar Street. Not because he was living there, he wasn't. He came back to stand on the sidewalk on the specific rectangle of public concrete where a deputy had crouched over his scattered belongings and told him he was invisible. He stood there for a while. Just stood there. A young man past 19, maybe 20, hoodie-up headphones, in moving fast in the way young people move when they have places to be and energy to burn. He slowed when he recognized Calvin from the news coverage. His eyes widened slightly. He pulled one earbud out. "Yo, you're that guy." Not a question. A recognition. Calvin nodded. The kid looked at the sidewalk, then back at him. "Hike, you didn't even yell at him. How'd you do that? How did you just not lose it?" Calvin thought about it, not because it was a hard question, but because it deserved a real answer rather than a quick one. "Because I knew I was right," he said, "and I didn't need to convince him of that. I needed to still be right when it was over." The kid stood there for a moment, turning that over. Then he nodded, slow, serious. The way people nod when something lands, put his earbud back in and kept walking. Calvin watched him go, then looked at the sidewalk one more time. He turned and walked toward home.
Calvin Brooks didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was steadier. In the moments when every instinct screams to rage, to collapse, to surrender, dignity is the one thing nobody can take from you unless you give it. He refused to give it. That refusal became the evidence. That evidence became the case. And the case became the truth that a corrupt system could not outlast. If this story stayed with you, drop your city and the time where you're watching from. Every comment is proof that people still care about justice. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly why we're here. We tell these stories because they matter. Because he matters. Because you do too.